We're going to continue our wellness girl chat today about our favorite mean girl, cortisol. And if you're not familiar with that reference, make sure you go and check out episode 31, the podcast episode right before this one, because we dive into why cortisol is the mean girl, where she's super popular, everyone wants to talk about her, but no one really fully understands her. So we're going to dive more into cortisol today, and more specifically, actionable steps on how you can better regulate and better balance your own cortisol. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and the founder of the Ella Wellness Sisterhood. And I have loved getting to sort of debunk some of the common health and wellness myths over the last few weeks. And so this might be our last episode on cortisol for this mini series, and I wanted to make sure that you guys not only understood the science, which is more, we'll cover that more in the previous episode, episode 31, but also understand some steps, again, that you can take to help your own cortisol levels and, again, balance out your own cortisol levels. And one of my biggest sort of pet peeves on this topic, as you guys know, is that people always say, lower your cortisol, ways to lower it, ways to lower it, ways to lower it. Anytime I've been researching these episodes or typing in cortisol to write the outline, I have been targeted with so many ads and YouTube videos all about lowering cortisol, lowering cortisol. But the problem is that we want those peaks and valleys throughout our day. It runs on this rhythm, kind of like our circadian rhythm. Like we want peaks in cortisol at the beginning of the day, and then a relative decrease in those levels at the end, with peaks and valleys throughout the day. Like we want that sort of high and low regulation throughout the day. It's not that everyone needs to lower their cortisol. And again, since it's known as a stress hormone, we all think of stress. Usually the first thought that comes to mind is bad, but there is some good stress, and it's just how we're better able to come back down to baseline after we experience a stressful circumstance. So that's my little soapbox on why I think we should better regulate our cortisol, learn how to tell if our cortisol is high or low, and how we can better balance it out depending on where it falls within that spectrum. So before we get into it, I still need y'all's help. If you've listened to my podcast episodes or newsletter in some of the previous weeks, you know that I'm working on creating and building the best, most comprehensive menstrual cycle program, and I want y'all's help on what would make it the most valuable for you. That includes how many workouts per week, the length of the program. I know some of the time when I sign up for a program, I'm like, 12 weeks, great, this is awesome. But then I only end up doing 4 weeks. So I want to make sure that it is structured the way that you guys want it to be structured and has details in it that you guys would like to see. So I'm going to leave a link for forms to fill out below. If you don't mind, there's also a spot, it's completely anonymous, but there's also a spot at the end to leave your email if you would like to be a free tester for the program. So I will be sending out some of the workouts for you guys to test. And if you're interested, that's the only part that's not anonymous. That way I can email you some of the workouts that are part of the program so that you guys can give me your feedback for that as well. But any and all feedback would be helpful if you've done a program, menstrual cycle or not, before, what you loved about it, what you hated about it, what you wished it included, all of those sorts of things. That way I can make it the most comprehensive program and the most valuable for all of us as women, especially in our menstrual cycles, so that we can actually work out with our bodies and not against it during the certain phases of our cycle. So again, I'll leave that link below, but I would super duper appreciate it if you guys could fill that out for me. Again, we'll dive into how to better regulate cortisol, and more of the science will be in episode 31, which was the episode right before that. So I'll refer you back there if you're like, wait, Kelsey, you brushed over that part too quick. But we'll dive into a little bit of the umbrella view of the science behind it today, but then we'll save most of the episode for actionable steps on how to better balance out our cortisol levels. So different parts of the brain sense stress, some sort of a physical trauma, emotional trauma, that can be exercise, that can be cold, that can be any sort of like mental health attack. It can be all sorts of stress. Various parts of our brain sense that signal, from the limbic system to the brainstem, amygdala, again with that fear. So some part of our brain senses stress. That signal is then sent to the hypothalamus, which is like the control center, the COO of our brain, which then sends a signal to the anterior pituitary gland via CRH. And then that anterior pituitary gland then it sends a signal to the adrenal glands, and more specifically the adrenal cortex, via ACTH in order to release cortisol into our bloodstream. And as far as the effects of cortisol goes, I mentioned this in episode 31, but I like to think of cortisol as the hormone that's released to help us in a stressful circumstance. And when we're in a stressful circumstance, again, like running from a bear, that's the first thing, that's like the most extreme thing that comes to mind for how to understand what our body does in response to that cortisol and being released into our bloodstream. So if we're running from a bear, we're going to need increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, so that our oxygen can reach all the parts of our body, all the parts of our brain that are helping to control us running from the bear. We need increased glucose levels for more energy. So it's going to mobilize glucose within our system in order for us to better have energy to run from the bear. We're going to be more clear-headed, so a lot more resources are going to be sent to our brain and more of that like central control center rather than the peripheries. And we're going to slow some of the other processes involved that could be saved for later. Things like digestion, things like glucose storage, again, because we need that glucose for energy currently. So all of those peripheral processes are the ones that are paused when we need to be running from a bear. So we can think of the processes involved in running from the bear and all the resources we need running from the bear as the systemic effects of cortisol. So how can we better regulate this cortisol, and what do we expect from cortisol? Again, we want it to have this relative peak in the morning and relative peaks and valleys throughout the day, and then slowly decrease towards the evening. So with all of these recommendations, whether on ways to raise your cortisol levels or lower your cortisol levels, we have to remember that we want that natural rhythm of cortisol release throughout the day. So for example, I'll get to this in a little bit, but one of the ways that we can increase our cortisol levels is through exercise. But if you struggle with cortisol regulation, or you know that your body struggles with cortisol regulation, it's probably not best to work out at the end of the day, knowing that that's where we want that relative decline in cortisol prior to going to sleep. So I'm going to break it up into what to do if we have high cortisol, how to better regulate it into that more natural flow of highs and lows, and then what to do if we have low cortisol, again, not wanting to raise it up, but better regulating those peaks and valleys, no matter if we sense that we have high cortisol or low cortisol, and if we have the signs and symptoms associated with a high cortisol release versus a low cortisol release. And I'm going to do a little bit of a disclaimer, but this is not medical advice for someone who has a diagnosis of Cushing's disease or of Addison's disease or of hypercortisolism or of hypocortisolism. This is just for the average person who thinks, hey, this could be something that is affecting my fatigue or affecting my weight gain, and how can I better learn to control it myself? If you have a formal medical diagnosis, or if you think you might have a more extreme form of hyper or hypocortisolism, please see a medical doctor who can better regulate it, because there are medical interventions, there are more specific processes and protocols that they have in order to help you navigate that a little bit better. So this is just simply for someone who, like me, who just senses that some days they have a little bit more of a tendency towards higher stress, and because of that needs to have better management tools in order to regulate it. Or for someone who has the signs and symptoms of lower cortisol throughout the day, especially in the morning where they're waking up like tired, fatigued, foggy, and they just want tips and tricks on how to better reset that rhythm that we expect throughout the day. So definitely not for those people. Again, some of these tactics might be used, but I highly recommend you see a medical professional on this, because this is definitely medication management, hormonal management from a medical standpoint is definitely not my expertise. So what are some signs and symptoms that our cortisol levels might be higher than normal and that we might need to lower them, or at least help them return back down to a normal sort of baseline after a stressful event? So the first one, weight gain on the face and abdomen. muscle weakness, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, excessive hair growth in women, and then weaker bones, so like osteoporosis and fracture. And if you recall in the previous podcast episode, we talked about how cortisol also helps to pull calcium from our bones in order to help power our nervous system and our muscle contractions. And so that's where that osteoporosis or that weaker bones sort of sign and symptoms comes from. High blood pressure, high blood sugar, again, we chatted about this earlier, but we want both of those in order to run from the bear. So sustained cortisol release will give us elevated levels of our blood sugar and then also an elevated blood pressure. Again, it's a good thing because we do want to run from the bear, but chronic elevated blood sugar levels or blood pressure can create some gastrointestinal, like GI digestive issues, but then also a vasculature issue when it comes to blood pressure. So how can we lower our cortisol? The very first thing is sleep. Again, sleep is that time where our body is going through its natural repair process. And if we're not going through that repair process for our muscles, for our brain health, there's going to be impaired release throughout our entire sort of neurohormonal adrenal system that helps with the cortisol release. And I have an episode on sleep hygiene that I will link below if you guys are curious about the cleansing that happens in the brain during sleep. We covered that on the glymphatic system, the little known glymphatic system, if you're looking for more sciencey sort of like in-depth description of that. The next thing is exercising regularly. Again, I think of the Legally Blonde quote about endorphins, like exercise releases endorphins, and endorphins make people happy, and happy people just don't kill other people. Like, that's what I think about this. So exercise also helps with the mental health benefits to lower cortisol. In the short term, it does raise cortisol. So that's why this can get counterintuitive. But again, like I said, we want a better balance. So when we exercise, we expect that peak, but we want our body to be better able to come back down to baseline. And overall, exercise also helps our mental health. And so from an overarching standpoint, helping out our stress and the way that we sense and perceive stress is really how exercise benefits us if we tend towards those higher cortisol levels. And again, we definitely, if we struggle with balancing that out, we don't want to do any of these things during a time period in the day where cortisol is supposed to be high or low. So for example, right now when we're talking about ways to lower our cortisol, we definitely don't want to be exercising later in the day because that's when we expect that cortisol to be lower. This one's more of a long-term tactic to help us lower our cortisol rather than in the short term, because in the short term we definitely expect exercise to increase our cortisol levels. This one's probably the most important, but mindfulness and breathwork practice. I lied, sleep is probably the most important one, but mindfulness and breathwork practices can really help us balance out those peaks and valleys throughout the day. So if we take some time and actually sense what our body is trying to tell us from an emotional standpoint, if we notice that we've just been going throughout the day, it might be worth it to sort of have these check-ins built in, to take some time and really go inward, be like, okay, how am I feeling? Not judging yourself for what you're feeling, but just noticing it. Noticing, what is Kelsey feeling right now? Am I in this hyper-stressed state when I don't need to be? And how can I get that back down to a more natural rhythm? And again, these mindfulness and breathwork practices tap into that parasympathetic nervous system, which is that rest, digest, muscle recovery part of our nervous system. That sympathetic, that fight or flight is usually what is needed when we're running from a bear, unless you're just like a super calm person, I guess. But most of us, 99.9999% of us, I'm sure would have that sympathetic fight or flight response activated if we are being chased by a bear. So this sort of opposes that and gets us more into that parasympathetic rest digest state. And I'd say this one really helps, especially with the breath work throughout the day when we want to return our levels back down to baseline rather than having this sustained heightened level throughout the day because we're experiencing stressful event after stressful event without taking the time to come back down to baseline. Journaling is also a huge one because again, anytime I try and go inward without writing it down, it's hard for me to stay on track. And so I just feel like journaling can really help, again, day to day, week to week, but especially when we're trying to more tune in to what we're actually feeling, what we're actually sensing in our own bodies and how we might be responding. And then the last two I have, one is more of an herbal approach, but it's ashwagandha that can help lower our cortisol levels. And again, we don't want that at the beginning of the day. We would rather have that right before bed, going to sleep, to help us lower those cortisol levels back down to a more natural resting rhythm. And then the other one I have is laugh and hang out with friends. Again, building that relational component, building that sort of community in order to decrease those overall stress levels, because being in community with other people and laughing with other people helps to better regulate our overall stress and therefore our overall cortisol. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, what are signs and symptoms that our cortisol is low or tends lower? And we have fatigue, weight loss unintentionally, decreased appetite, low blood pressure. And again, all of these things, if we think about cortisol being needed to run from a bear, all of these things would kind of oppose that, right? If we have fatigue, if we have unintentional weight loss, if we have decreased appetite and low blood pressure, all of these things are sort of in opposition to why we would need to run from a bear. And so if you notice yourself being a little bit more fatigued in the morning, having a lower blood pressure throughout the day, and sometimes, again, low blood pressure is a good thing too, so this can get kind of tricky, but just understanding whether or not that lower blood pressure is because you have really good heart health, or if overall your system is just having a hard time like ramping up. So how can we better balance out our cortisol if we tend towards that lower end of the spectrum? Morning sunlight is huge. So I mentioned earlier that our cortisol release is on a rhythm throughout the day. Again, we want that morning sunlight early in the morning to help us improve our overall release of cortisol throughout the day. So that can really, really help. We also, exercise is on this list again, because exercise in the short term definitely helps to raise our cortisol levels, which is why exercise is on both lists, because again, exercise also helps with our mental health and our overall stress management, which is why it was also there to help us lower our cortisol levels if we tend towards those higher cortisol levels. Cold also helps, cold exposure, and then caffeine. But remember, we also want our bodies to be able to naturally regulate our own cortisol release. And so if we're able to drink something like caffeine in order to raise our overall cortisol levels, it's not necessarily telling our bodies that, hey, we need to still release cortisol. It's like, oh, she's getting this from an alternative way anyways, why do we need to kick in or anything? So I like to tell people 60 to 90 minutes after waking, that's when the caffeine should kick in, because again, dopamine, cortisol, all of these hormones are slowly ramping up for the day. They're also slowly waking up, and a lot of times they take even longer to wake up than someone who is not a morning person, because we definitely want to wait 60 to 90 minutes before having that caffeine in an ideal world, because it does enhance our cortisol levels, but we also want our body to be able to produce that hormone on its own. Caffeine can only help. So I hope all of these little tips and tricks are helpful. And it's not necessarily about all of us wanting to lower our cortisol, but understanding that at different points throughout the day, we might have trouble raising or lowering it, raising it and returning it back to baseline, depending on the stressful circumstances that we are presented with throughout the day. So I wanted to give actionable items that we can all use in order to better tune into our bodies and tune into how we're really feeling, how we're really navigating different moments, different stressful circumstances, hour by hour, minute by minute, so that we can have a better understanding and better regulation of our own cortisol. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you stuck around to the end, thank you so, so much. I super appreciate all of you guys for following along, liking, following, subscribing, commenting, whatever. Like, it means the world to me. So if you don't mind, and if you have time, I would appreciate a follow, a subscribe, a share of this episode, especially with someone you think might benefit from it. And I thank you for joining us for this cortisol mini series, and I'll see you guys again on the next Wellness Big Sis podcast episode.